Welcome to the afternoon session of the Photo Archive Symposium 5 called Using Photographs. I get to escape the problematic idea of photographic objectivity and get right into using photographs. I want to thank the GRI, the Huntington, and the Kunsthistorisches Institut for including the Getty Museum in this event by having me moderate this panel. The first speaker is Paul Conway, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. His research and teaching focuses on archival science, the digitization and preservation of cultural heritage resources, and the ethics of new information technologies. His funded research projects at Michigan have included developing a model of expert user interaction with large collections of digitized photographs, modeling and measuring the quality of large-scale digitization as presented in the Haiti Trust Digital Library, and exploring the value of creating thematic aggregations of digitized content from multiple organizations. Prior to joining the University of Michigan faculty in 2006, he was an archivist at the National Archives and Records Administration and a senior administrator for the libraries at Yale and Duke Universities. He is a fellow of the Society of American Archivists and holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. Michigan all the way. Some of his selected publications that deal with the idea of archives, beginning in 2008, I'm just going to name the titles and not the publications, are Best Practices for Digitizing Photographs, a Network Analysis of Influences, 2009, The Image and the Expert User, also 2009, Building Meaning in Digitized Photographs, 2010, Preservation in the Age of Google, Digitization, Digital Preservation, and Dilemmas, Modes of Seeing, Digitized Photographic Archives, and the Experienced User. And this article was a winner of the SAA Fellows Ernst Posner Prize for the best article in the American Archivist. And then in 2011, the article with Ricardo Ponsalan, Fields of Vision Towards a New Vision of Visual Literacy for Digitized Archival Photographs, again, a winner of the Hugh A. Tyler Prize conferred by the Association of Canadian Archivists. Most recently, 2015, he published Digital Transformations and the Archival Nature of Surrogates. Today, he is going to be speaking to us about an archaeology of seeing, in which he will unify his two earlier articles of 2010 and 2011, Modes of Seeing and Fields of Vision, which are based on 7 case studies across digitized collections from the Library of Congress.
Thank you. Like everyone else before me, I'd like to thank Anne and Tracy and Costanza and the Getty and the Huntington for putting this together, for inviting me to be part of this. It's awesome. I have not worked closely with any of the faculty members or the speakers, so it's been a joy to get to hear their perspectives on digitization or on the artifact. I'll put my own view on the table and we'll see where it goes from there. My motivations for this was to recognize that we're increasingly inconsequential. Anything that we say here really doesn't matter. When we get the sound of two black holes colliding, it's like, okay, what can we say about digitization? You know, so with some amount of humbleness, I'm going to present the pieces of 2 studies that are then informed by 4 or 5 years of research work that I've done in the digital domain since these articles were finished. What I'm going to do is give you a little bit of the theoretical context as the motivation for the studies in the first place. That motivation has changed, and my conclusion will come back to that. Again, some of the key findings of the user study, which I've reconfigured. I had an insight about reorganizing the results to give a different way of thinking about the findings of users, and then the implications for the archive, transparency, and digital transformation. I have to say, you know, sort of as an editorial comment going forward, I'm pretty pro-digital when it comes to these issues of objectivity and meaning making. I've found that users generally get more benefit than they lose from the digital enterprise, and so that's sort of where I'm headed with this. The point of departure is Mitchell's literary critic, Chicago literary critic's notion of representation, in which he proposes two axes that govern the transformation, the preparation of any kind of representation. The axis of representation is the process of taking something known and making something that represents the known, whether it's a rock with a dab of paint or a group of children playing on the beach with a camera. And that the maker has a communication relationship with an unknown and often uncared for user. The examples in art are legion of great artists who died with 90% of their work unseen. But there is a hypothesized relationship between the person making something and the user. In Mitchell's model, that communicative mandate encompasses the intentionality of the maker in the first place, the various processes. We've been talking about them this morning, processes to make the image in the first place, whether that's art to represent war or photography to represent art. And then the materiality of the product that's produced. My point with going through this slide is that we can begin to map the same basic communicative processes through to the digital, in which the camera becomes the force for intentionality, powered by the maker, just as the scanner or the digital camera is for the digitizer. I don't find digitizer sometimes is considered to be a pejorative term for people that do digital, but I actually think it's like maker. We're doing things, making products. So the digitizer, the darkroom magic that has always been a source for questions about truth and objectivity, whether it's Ansel Adams or your casual local photographer removing blackheads from the beauty queen, it's the same thing. And then the materiality of the artifact is now represented. I'll make the case that it's represented by the data that is material in its form as anything that is photographic. The problem with the challenge that we have with this notion of representation, and where I'm trying to go with this toward the end, is that Mitchell's and many people who have talked about communication in a representation mode, it's a one-way street. It's the communication model of the maker to the user instead of the user to the maker back, as if there may be a loop that could be closed, and especially where issues of objectivity and meaning are an open question in the digital arena. That's the reason we're having this symposium, is because there's a lot of open questions. The loop needs to be closed between the maker and the users, and that's what I'm trying to do. What I did was work very closely with the Library of Congress in a rather lengthy process of identifying some individuals who are strong users of digitized materials from the Prints and Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. I'm not going to go into, the two articles go into more detail about the method, but what I ended up coming up with after starting with about 30 names and doing multiple pre-studies is finding 7 that are not statistically representative of a user community, but archetypes of a particular way of seeing the digitized product. And what I did is my focus was on expertise. I have, this is the only long quote in this whole presentation, but I really like Hoffman's, Robert Hoffman and his group of organizational theorists focus on expertise, which is drawn from a guild model that looks at stages of expertise, starting from apprentice all the way up to expert. And I used this as my example of looking for people who met this. So they're not necessarily scholars by definition, and they're not necessarily, in my group there are professional researchers, there's a doctoral student, I'm going to show you who the users are in a second. But the notion of expertise goes to the idea that one can actually be an expert on some small piece of the world without having a PhD necessarily. So the group of scholars, I wrote back to all 7, say, I'm going to go to the Getty, and I'm going to be talking about this work. Would you mind if I named you? And they all said, sure. So in the articles, they were all individual, they were all blinded out. And I thought it might be useful and interesting to put names, at least, on the people that we're talking about here instead of just numbers. So the first, Bob Zeller is a prominent member of the Center for Civil War Photography. He represents a network of amateur experts on Civil War photography. They produce books, websites, an annual conference, and also reenactments, not of the Civil War, but of Civil War photography. It's amazing. I've been to some of their workshops, and it's phenomenal. You tromp around Gettysburg with wet plate cameras, with people who do it, and you participate in the process. There's nothing like doing it to actually understand how it works. The second person, Heather Sontag, at the time she was a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin working on Turkestan photo albums. We're going to have another talk about photo albums, so Heather was one of the people that I worked with. She actually completed her dissertation, hooray. It is not published and it's not available through dissertation abstracts because, like so many humanistic doctoral students, she's completely paranoid that if she has to hold on to it until she gets a chance to turn it into a book, because only the book is going to count, not the dissertation. We've got that little problem out there. Then there's Joe Manning, Mornings on Maple Street, a website. He lives out of North Adams, Massachusetts. His claim to fame, and he's been interviewed on NPR and a variety of other sources, is he's taken Lewis Hines' child labor photographs from the early part of the century and applied state-of-the-art genealogical methods to identify, find, track down the descendants of these children. And he's put his information on his website. He's gotten so good at it that the Library of Congress has taken his metadata and put it into the Lewis Hine collection files. Rich Remsburg is a professional documentary. He works for Northern Light Films. He does PBS-type documentary, the research for documentary films. And then he's a particularly passionate amateur proponent of Depression-era roots music and has published a book on that, as well as been named in about 30 different films that he's done the research for. Mary Jane Apple is a private researcher who is particularly obsessed about Doris and Russell Lee, a Depression-era photographer who particularly liked reflections. It's a long story. She's written a biography, it's unpublished, and she's done a lot of exhibits for the Smithsonian. She works under contract. Amy Pastan works under contract to the Library of Congress to produce a series of books on the FSA, the Farm Security Administration books, the photograph collection. And then finally, Bill Hickman, who's a member of SABRE, for the men in the room who like baseball statistics, because there aren't any women in SABRE, from the best that I can tell. SABRE is the Society for American Baseball Research, and they are the people that do sabermetrics. Okay, what Bill Hickman does is he's part of a community of 110 obsessives who want to identify every baseball player who ever played the game in the United States of America. They are 90% there. Okay. So what I did was I interviewed individuals at their homes, or my question for them is, wherever you do your research, I'm going to come to you. And I spent approximately 4 hours per person visiting with people in their dens, their offices, library carols, or wherever it happened to be, using their technologies to observe and interview their interaction with the Library of Congress's digital resources. And what I ended up coming up with after many iterations is a 3-part model that suggests that people have different ways of seeing the digital. And they also have differing relationships with the source. And that's what I want to try to walk through really quickly, is ways of seeing what the digital means to them, and then emotionally and technically their connection to the source material. Okay, so I've got landscaping, storytelling, and discoursing. Discovering. Okay, the first one is landscaping. The two earlier talks we had today, the first two talks, are prime examples of landscaping research. Landscaping is the most archival. It's focused on the context of a particular image within its socio-technical, the history of the photographer, the history of the culture in its setting, and where these images fit as plural objects. Landscaping is rarely done with a single item, although every once in a while one writes a book or an article driven by a single picture. But the focus of landscaping is on establishing it's what I call it beyond the frame. It's more important what's outside the frame than what is inside the frame. So a photograph exists, a digital photograph exists within a sociocultural landscape. We had three, I should have put the names up here. So Remsburg is P4, Sontag, the Turkish photo album group, is P2, and P5. Apple, hey, good, thank you, all right. So then the second group of, in Remsburg, so Apple does the Turkish photo albums, and I should have put the names in. Remsburg, the private photographer who's doing Roots era music, is also less interested, like a traditional archival view of photographs. Any one photograph may not be the message. The story comes from juxtaposition, it comes from relationships, and in the case of the Farm Security Administration, the negatives are named they're numbered in the order that they were taken off the camera. The only things that don't make it into the list are the ones that someone killed along the way. So it's not the full strip off the camera, it's the good ones. And even some of those didn't survive. But Remsburg made great hay out of many sequences of photographs. Storytelling focuses on the story of the picture itself. The context may be important, and in some cases there's some of my informants do storytelling and landscaping, or storytelling and description in discovery in the same mix. But in this particular case, we've got Remsburg and Pastan and Bob Zeller, and P3 is Bowie. I'll get it, because I know him by Joe Manning, the person that's doing the child labor photographs with a genealogical approach. This is one where it was named in the database originally as Hines, Spinners in a Wintel Cotton Manufacturing Company, North Carolina, 1908. He tracked down to find out that this is Coralie Griffin from Wintel, North Carolina, found her granddaughter, and then did a whole interview with the granddaughter about their particular history, wrote it up, puts it on his website. These are evocative. In many cases, the story is the thing that evokes the emotion. And for Joe Manning, the emotional connection to this girl through the photograph is as strong as if he was standing there holding the photograph in his hands. Joe Manning has never touched any of the photographic prints from the Library of Congress. He's only worked digitally. Amy Pastan, working on a book with Delano, also tells the story of a particular photo. The fact that it took Delano some number of tries to find any prisoner who would look happy. And his sequence of photographs show one resistant prisoner after another until somebody got up and mimed for the camera. And so the story of the cultural context of that specific photo is really important. Landscaping and storytelling together, Mary Jane Apple is particularly intrigued with the fact that the story comes through the landscape. It's one successive image, cumulatively building an argument for a story. She's working on Russell Lee's work, and Russell's travels across the United States. She's plotted all of his Depression-era travels on a United States road map. and then map the individual photographs to the places he decided to stop on his travels. Lee also liked reflections. There are quite a few photos of himself in his own photographs, either the flash or the photo itself. This one evokes the fact that he might have been hamming it up with the 4 people at the counter, and then just got up and took a picture with probably no notice whatsoever. The story tells the story, and it's largely decontextualized. Discovering is where I found some of the more interesting non-traditional uses of photographs, and ones that are primarily driven by the availability of digital surrogates. In the case of the Depression era work, the fact that these are high-res negatives that have been scanned by the Library of Congress allows for zooming and detail that can't be found elsewhere. The fact that entire negatives have been digitized and then made positive makes it possible to correctly identify. This was known as Weldon-Wyckoff, but it's really Pennock. And in most cases, this would have been cropped and printed in some kind of baseball guide, and you wouldn't have even known what you were looking at. But being able to see the whole object in its digital form, in positive, with zoom capability, gives people a lot of options. The same with Sontag, who is at heart a landscaper. But at the end of the day, her landscape story about Turkestan albums and the control of the Russian military is really driven by looking at faces on ships. And just being able to distinguish in Africa a dark-skinned person from someone who has a suntan. That's detail. The ultimate work by the Center for Civil War Photography, none of whom have ever handled any of the prints from Brady, Sullivan, Gardner, or any of the Civil War photographers, is the pretty incredible work that they have done with the large-scale images of Civil War negatives, either stereographs or positive stereographs or negative glass plate negatives, which yield far more power, image power than any print could. In this particular case, it's a picture of devastated Atlanta right after Sherman left, Union troops milling around with high res. Someone saw something interesting. It turns out that a photographer had set up a stereo viewer, a penny a view. Now, they weren't looking at pictures of Civil War photography. You know, what were a bunch of men who had not been home for a bunch of months looking at. Okay, so the story comes from the ability to see and recognize, and then the ability to perhaps imagine something that may or may not have been the case. That's a 4-sided viewer. 4 people at a time could look at the image. So what we have is a slide here that now stretches out a little bit more on the relationship of these images to the surrogate. In the case of discovery, the image is the goal of discovery is to find something no one has ever seen before. It's something that's underappreciated, unseen, or unknown. Without high-res digital imaging, the goal for visual learning or visual literacy can't be met. You can't go to the Library of Congress and put a 10x loop down on top of Matthew Brady's glass plate negative. You can't do it. And so the notion that the source is the source of authority, the source is the source of authenticity just doesn't hold water for people who do this kind of work. The intrinsic qualities of the source feed the digital, but in themselves they transfer. For a discovery user, the authenticity of the source transfers to the digital and then is amplified. With storytelling, the composition of the object itself in its frame, as we heard this morning, so in and outside the frame becomes the critical component. In many cases, the information for storytelling is derived from metadata. with or in association with the original item. The problem with most expert users is they don't like library cataloging. What they want is what information was on the print. They want what was on the envelope. They want what was in the photographer's file system. The catalog from the late Gardner's catalog is crucial information. And then the image itself becomes an authentic record in which the digitizer is the source of authenticity, not the record, it's not the source itself. And then finally, landscaping is the most traditional focus that we have, where the visual goal here, I call it landscaping because it's often geospatial or temporal in its character. Both of the presentations we heard this morning had a geophysical and a temporal component. A point in time, time passes, and they're located in Paris, in London, in a specific location. So the landscape, it becomes the geo-temporal context, becomes the source of visual learning. And then these items are located within that particular space. Object sequencing and structural metadata become crucial. It's a rare kind of a metadata that will tell you that this is the third item in a sequence, because mostly our cataloging as well as the digitization has tended to treat each object as a separate entity. And landscapers value the contextual metadata more than they value the library cataloging metadata. And then, so the context beyond the image is what's crucial. So the second piece, I'm going to revisit, this is the second aspect of digital surrogacy, and then I'll reach some broader conclusions here. Mitchell's, an article he wrote in 2011 about visual literacy proposed the distinction between a picture and an image, whereas a picture is something you can hang on the wall and it can break, whereas the image is the meaning that's within the space. And his argument was that the meaning can transcend the object, the information. So in the picture domain, the values must be derived from the source. If you're a picture domain person, you need the source and the authenticity of the source in order to make sense out of what it is you're seeing. Although for digital, even people who are picture people, they particularly value the convenience of access. They trust the source, but love the access. So when you hear in library land about, well, we're digitizing for access, we're responding to this kind of a view. We're still reinforcing the value of the original source material while at the same time enhancing access to those materials. Picture domain specialists recognize the limits of digital imaging as it currently existed or as it existed in 2008 or 9. For image domain, the values are derived from the digital imaging system as a whole, and that the aura of the image, the original source material, transfers to the digital source, and that the remediation or the value of the meaning comes through the screen. I found with many of the 7 people that I interviewed, their emotional attachment to the lousy images they saw on their 10-year-old uncalibrated monitors had every bit of emotional power as we sometimes get by turning the corner at the Getty and seeing Julia Margaret Cameron's original photograph. As many times as people would say, look at that. Wait a minute, let me show you something. Look at that. It's the same emotional reaction you get when you bring your family to a museum and somebody turns the corner ahead of you and then goes and grabs your friend and says, come, look at this. It's that same visceral emotional reaction. So I ended up trying to, this is not in the article, I tried to stretch this as a kind of a continuum because people tended to be one or the other. 3 of the 7 tended toward picture people and the other 5 tended very firmly and proudly toward being image literate specialists. So where the surrogate invokes the memory, it tends to be where memory is the thing. Then people are closer to the picture, whereas imagination is sparked by the image. Now that's a radical idea because those of you that have served up original source images in a reading room might say that it's every bit as imaginative to sit there with your white gloves and your controlled lighting and your surveillance system in place, and the imagination happens. But more often than not, somebody gets a good idea in your reading room, then asks for a copy, and then they do their work on the copy. Proudly so. So this is the other thing I did is pull apart the circles. And what I realized is that your view for users, the view of your allegiance to the digital image versus the source, and to your view of digital imaging has as much to do with the community in which you are a part as it does to your own particular perspective on the imaging process. And so in the case of my subjects, all of the discoverers are intimate, deeply engaged members of a very active community in which the view of the source is reinforced by the community. Like I said, the Center for Civil War Photography has about 30 active members. None of them have ever been to the Library of Congress. The Northern Lights production, Remsburg, works virtually online, doesn't touch the original source materials. The Sabre folks, if they can recognize the baseball player from 1925, they're happy camper. They don't need to put the picture in their hands. And the same with Sontag, who was very protective of her dissertation research, but when I asked her about her network, waxed ecstatic about the librarians and the archivists and the scholars that she is connected to through the National Library of Russia. So what does this mean? It means that this is my view on what seems to be a wistful complaint, that digital imaging is somehow forcing us to give up authenticity in favor of it looks like. It's good enough, it looks like. And we don't want to be like these guys sitting around when we're, after we've retired, kind of wistfully wishing that we could have seized on authenticity. In my research with expert users, the primary locus of objectivity and trust, which media scholars have pointed out have both epistemological and ethical facets, are understood as embedded in the trustworthiness of the digitizing agency. In this case, the Library of Congress's extensive and ongoing digitization program. The trust is not between you and the source. It's trust in the processes of intermediate making. Not every organization is as trustworthy as the Getty or the Library of Congress, and that we may have as much difficulty with the transparency of the process as we do with the transparency of the process than we do with the technologies of digitization themselves. This is my little riff on transparency. This is one transparency. Transparency has two facets. This is the funny facet. The not so funny, or the one that doesn't lend itself to a New Yorker cartoon, is the idea of transparency as being able to understand how something works. If an engine, if you can pop the hood and you can see how it works, then the process is transparent. When President Obama long ago in 2009 said he was going to make government more transparent, he was going to speed up Freedom of Information Act, he was going to declassify more material, he was going to put better websites on place so that the government would be more transparent. It's that form of transparency that we need in digital imaging. And so that gets me to, I must be close to out of time. Am I? Okay. I'm not going to go through, I'm going to be publishing this through the proceedings. But what I wanted to do is give you heads up about an emergent interdiscipline called media archaeology that I think is going to solve the transparency problem for us. If we're willing to embrace the digital imaging process as fundamentally about making new things and not as representing something in a new form, then there's an analytical method from media archaeology that will give us a way of thinking about digital imaging technology from a user's perspective and from a technology perspective. Media archaeology combines media theory, cultural aspects of 20th century audiovisual culture, and direct challenges to the forward march of the history of technology. The person that I've featured here, Wolfgang Ernst, whose writings have influenced everyone in this meta-discipline of media archaeology, sees the field as reinventing media studies. This is the quote, and then I'm going to end, because I don't want, we'll be able to discuss this later. Media archaeology is both a method and an aesthetics of practicing media criticism, a kind of epistemological reverse engineering. I love that phrase. I think I put it up there, didn't I? Epistemological, it's knowledge re-engineering in reverse. And an awareness of the moments when media themselves, not exclusively humans anymore, become active archaeologists of knowledge. In defending his use of archaeology to describe his method, Ernst writes that like classical archaeologists and media archaeologists together are fascinated by the hardware of culture. But what drastically separates an archaeological object from a technical artifact is that the latter discloses its essence only when it's operating. Think of a vase versus a website. The archaeological gaze is a way of seeing media objects, enumerative rather than narrative, descriptive rather than discursive, infrastructure rather than sociological, taking numbers into account instead of just letters and images. If we cling, my argument here is that if we cling to the representative model and only seek merely to improve communication between the digitizer and the users, we'll miss what's actually happening when we digitize, which is to create something new that then inspires a new and a completely different way of seeing the visual than the source material from which the original was created. Now, if that's a threat or a challenge, then we've got to deal with that. But the reality is that the digital is different, not a copy. And I think that what these scholars are suggesting, and this is my last two sentences, is that an understanding of the nature of surrogacy of photography must move well beyond the representational paradigm to consider the complex interactions of digital system materiality. An archaeology of seeing in a machine-mediated visual culture surely circumscribes the communication that digitizers must foster with their users, if the end users, expert or not, are to trust what they are seeing. And that's, at the end of the day, what we want, is to trust what they see. So thank you for giving me the extra 5 minutes. Thank you.
I think we do have about 5 minutes for questions, 6 actually. You really packed in a lot at the end. So that's hard to kind of tear apart or break apart.
So skip the end.
I want to talk to you about this almost dichotomy or binary between the maker and the user of the archive, and what you were talking about just now is that it's the connection between them, and you described in one of your articles that it's the computer screen and graphical user interface that connects the two. And is that what you're basically getting to, is finding new graphical user interfaces so that it's not just, and here's a copy, here's a surrogate of the original photograph?
The screen mediates meaning in this particular case. The screen may be your iPhone, or it may be a high-res monitor that you've got in your office, but the screen does mediate the meaning. So for me, the communication challenge with digital imaging is to develop mechanisms to educate the end user about what they're actually experiencing. At one level, it may be technical documentation that is usually honored in the breach. Like software engineers, the last thing they do is write the documentation. Digital image specialists, the last thing they do is write the little note that says what it is that they've actually done. So one form is, through the screen, is explanation and education and tutorials. The other is the ability, perhaps, to give people multiple views of the same thing. the Library of Congress is experimenting with that through prints and photographs, where you can have multiple versions, the archival master and different versions. So, but we want to recognize that everything is mediated through the screen, and so the screen has to is the source of meaning and communication, not the source behind it.
I found really. Do we have questions? Oh, okay. Because otherwise, I have another one. Yes, let's go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. And I had a question going back to a point you made earlier about the epistemology of objectivity being also ethical.
Yes.
And I was wondering, just from your work with the Library of Congress, what sorts of ethical or moral or political challenges face particularly state archives and libraries today? I mean, in thinking about digitizing photographic archives, or if any?
Yeah. There's two things that I had in mind. One has to do with, let me see, I wrote an article about this, so I'm trying to summarize it in a sentence or two. The problem that users confront, both at the Library of, not so much at the Library of Congress, but in the workaday world of digital libraries, is what the user is given in the way of a derivative in no way represents the archival master source file. And the fact that even the most rigorous imaging guidelines from the federal government specify how to create an archival master, and then allow you to do whatever you darn well please to correct the color, to crop, to skew, to reverse polarity, do whatever you want without any expectation for communication. And I think that that's pretty close to unethical professional practice, to say you're following a guideline and then to deliver something that nowhere near meets the guideline. So that's the side that I've focused mostly on, which is what's the impact of digitization guidelines and best practices on the way users experience the net result. And there's some really significant issues there. The second related issue is more legal. This morning we had a question that was waltzing into copyright questions. And I think that the trend that is now admirably being fought by places like the New York Public Library to remonetize and recontrol the public domain, using the excuse of digitization to lock back up their resources, I think is, if it's not unethical, it's something, other than right. And so if a photograph, this is where the relationship between the source and the image becomes such an important thing. If the source is in the public domain, so should the image in all of its rich facets. And I don't think that that's common practice. And it may be justified on the basis that, well, we paid good money to get this done. And we're investing, we have to recoup some of the cost of our investment in building a system or doing digitization. But I think morally and ethically, if the source is open, so should the image.
But don't you find more institutions going towards open content?
More and more, but there was a period about 5 or so years ago where it was beginning to look like, well, the way it was, Denver Public Library is an example. Denver Public Library would deliver a moderately useful thumbnail, 640 pixels by whatever, as their large size. Beautiful stuff. Behind it is a full-blown archival master, and for $12.95 or $15.95 or $17.95 you could buy that. And that's where you can't do discovery on a 640 pixel image of a hand-colored photograph of a Ute Indian. You cannot do it. And so,
well, we have a time for one more, and then we'll have to hold the rest until the panel discussion.
Paul, thanks for a great talk, which was every bit as good as I was expecting. I was particularly struck by your observation that we have, in our eagerness to apply standardized description, we have lost sight of annotation as a quality of value, particularly to scholars. And as somebody who, one of the first digitization projects I was involved with was a correspondence collection, where we made the decision that, despite the impact on the overall storage cost of the resulting digital files, we would digitize not only the front but also the back of every envelope in that collection. Can you talk about what are the values that we're applying as archivists, as digital preservationists, as digitizers that cause us to make that sacrifice between, for metadata over annotation, even though we know that's of value to scholars?
One is it's sometimes rare. The users I interviewed thought they'd died and gone to heaven when they had the metadata that was closely associated with the source of the object, but it's not always the case. So sometimes we're left with a decision as librarians or archivists about what level of metadata to apply to a given object. I had almost universal disdain from my group. I didn't write about it because it was very negative. But the notion of subject headings from the controlled Library of Congress subject headings field applied. Think American memory, the 10 million objects or so that are in American memory that all have 4, 5, 6, 7 Library of Congress subject headings, and then they make them hyperactive. So you can click on something like Cincinnati, Ohio, Civil War, and you click on it, and then this huge pile of stuff comes back, and that wasn't useful. So then the other side of it is annotation, and there we're up against the problem of lousy contributed content, which a lot of people, including at the University of Michigan, my colleagues, are trying to figure out how to incentivize people to do really good work. What my group showed is if you engage the right communities of practice, a Joe Manning or a Civil War photographers group who are passionately engaged with the inquiry that they're doing, they produce super high quality work that couldn't be done internally. So it's a matter of becoming discerning about what we mean by annotation. The Library of Congress did a Flickr test a few years ago where they opened up their files and let people tag them on Flickr, and it was a very mixed bag. People would take a picture of, tag a parachute, and they would tag it white. And it's like, or they would tag somebody with a crew cut and say, great haircut. Okay, so that's the battle we're up against, though, in opening up. And so what it does is it challenges the notion of expertise. It's like, let's focus, my research has said, let's focus a lot of our attention and our energy on people who know how to use this material and learn from them and take their lead in terms of, and one last thing, with the group of, has been working most closely with the Farm Security Administration records, the 172,000 negatives from the Depression-era photographers. There was so much demand from expert users that the Library of Congress went and redigitized the entire set of 35 millimeter negatives. And we used to say 10 years ago, you got to do it right the first time because we're never going to be able to do it again. But we might be able to iterate through this process. In response, though, not to what we think is the right thing, but in response to demonstrated value gained from the digital.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of other things that one can mention, and I hope we get back to, especially this idea of the experts who, in one of your articles, you write that they have more nuanced ways of seeing the evidence in the archival record rather than simply more experience, and this idea of community. So I hope we get back to that. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Our next speaker is Glenn Willumson, who is the Florida Foundation Research Professor of Art History and the Director of the Graduate Program in Museum Studies at the University of Florida. Prior to taking the position in Florida, he was the senior curator at the Palmer Museum at Penn State, and a curator here at the Getty Research Institute. He has curated numerous exhibitions, including those on American daguerreotypes, the Pincus Collection of Contemporary Art, and the video work of Bill Viola. He is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Stanford University, Yale University, and the Center for Creative Photographs. Do you ever work in Florida? He has published numerous essays and is the author of W. Eugene Smith and the Photographic Essay in 1992 and The Iron Muse, Picturing the First Transcontinental Railroad in 2013. Among the publications he has written that relate to the idea of archives are the following: the Getty Research Institute, Materials for a New Photographic History in the History of Photography in spring 1998, the photo album as cultural artifact in a book on the photographic albums published in Paris in 2000, and Making Meaning, Photographic Materiality in the Library and the Art Museum, a chapter of the publication Photographs, Objects, Histories, that appeared in 2004. Today he is going to speak to us, and I think I'm supposed to advance this. Okay, on personal and institutional photo archives and changing subjectivities, which deal with two photo archives that were assembled by art historians, Sir Ellis Waterhouse and Jan van den Meulen. So Glenn, here you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia, for the intro. Like everyone so far, I also want to thank the organizers of this conference, Costanza Carafa and Ann, and Tracy Schuster. And in particular, I want to single out Tracy Schuster, who has helped me innumerable times manage my way through the photo archives here at the Getty Research Institute. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to participate in this conference. And I presume all of you, like I have had your mind stimulated to think in many new ways about the photo archives. Stay up there. Oh, well. The promise of photographs, let's get started with this first. Tired of looking at my name. The promise of photographs to create objective pictorial records of works of art has been embraced by scholars almost since the moment of photography's discovery. William Henry Fox Talbot, whose announcement of the negative-positive process led to photography as we came to know it in the 19th and 20th centuries, described photographs as obtained by the mere action of light upon sensitive paper. They have been formed or depicted by optical and chemical means alone and without the aid of anyone acquainted with the art of drawing. It is needless, therefore, to say that they differ in all respects and as widely as possible from their origin, from plates of the ordinary kind, which owe their existence to the united skill of artist and engraver. They are impressed by nature's hand. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the instrumental power of the photograph was so persuasive among the educated public that in certain circumstances it might substitute for direct experience. The Western Gallery of Art in Kansas City, later renamed the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, boasted in its 1892 catalog that viewers to its exhibition halls could see 20 oil copies of works of the great masters. They characterized the quality of those works in photographic terms. The perfection with which the character and quality of the drawings have been reproduced may be judged by comparing the painted copies with photographs made directly from the originals. And the exhibition itself was in fact these 20 oil copies and 500 framed photographs of works of art. The acceptance and reliability and the acceptance of the reliability and objectivity of the photograph was widespread. As Destin and Gallison have argued, this belief was embraced by scientists as well as art historians, with photography soon replacing engraving in scientific and art historical publications and archives. The connection was made explicit by Bernard Berenson when he proclaimed connoisseurship of paintings without reference to photographs quackery. Whoops, let's try that one. There we go. In 1893, calling for the use of large archives of photographs in art historical practice, Berenson wrote, "It is not at all difficult to see at any rate 9/10 of a great master's work in such rapid succession that the memory of them will be fresh enough to enable the critic to determine the place and value of any picture. And when this continuous study of originals is supplemented by isochromatic photographs, such a comparison attains almost the accuracy of physical sciences." The camera's mechanistic rendering offered the promise of eliminating personal subjectivity at the same time that it confirmed the investigators' empirical observations. Photography was embraced quickly and, for the most part, uncritically, because in the latter part of the 19th century, as art history struggled to define itself as a discipline, photography offered objective evidence with which one could practice a scientific method of inquiry. Historically, photo archives have been understood in this context as passive receptacles of scholarly interest, dispassionate collections drawing their influence from the presumed innocence of the photograph and from the power of multiple views, stripped of their interpretive context and available for comparison or as support for scholarly argument. We believe in the objectivity of the photograph because it hides its culture, its subjectivity, behind a shimmering facade of reflected representation. And I want to use as a kind of metaphor this cross-section of a photographic print, a metaphor for what I'm about to describe. Despite its connection to reality, photography is an abstract, subjective medium. There are many things that the photograph does not capture: color, scale, and spatial context, to name just a few. But the question is more complicated than just what is not captured in black and white. The first impression of the photograph is not of the support or facture, as it is in painting, but the subject matter displayed on the glossy paper. When one looks at a photograph, you do not immediately think of the subjective base of the image, the maker of the photograph, the person who valued it highly enough to save it, and later the viewer's subjective position. And it seems to me, and we can probably get into this in the discussion, that part of that is what Paul's users were responding to. That is the immediate subject matter of the image. Berenson's contemporary, Heinrich Wölfflin, addressed one aspect of the photograph's subjectivity in 1896. It seems to be the widely held opinion that sculptural artworks can be photographed from any side, and it is left totally to the discretion of the photographer at which angle to the figure to set up his machine. The public buys these photographs in good faith, believing that with a mechanistic made illustration, nothing of the original could be lost. It does not know that an old figure has a particular point of view. It would thus not be superfluous once and for all to make it more widely understood how sculptural photographs should be made and guide the viewer back to seeking out the view that corresponds with the artist's intention. While acknowledging the impact of the subjectivity of the photograph, Wölfflin's claim for an accurate vision implies that he, like Berenson, believed in the fundamental objectivity of photography. But despite his insistence that the photograph can provide an accurate representation of sculpture, it's clear that Wölfflin's solution simply substitutes the subjectivity of the art historian for that of the cameraman. Keeping in mind the positioning of photography by Berenson and Wölfflin, what I'd like to do now is to turn to the question of photography's creation and reception in two specific photo archives that are housed here at the Getty Research Institute. The collection of art historian Ellis Waterhouse includes thousands of photographs. Despite his prodigious archive, Waterhouse appears to have been skeptical about the objectivity and usefulness of photography. Unlike Wölfflin, he did not pay too much attention to the medium. Waterhouse bought photographs from a variety of commercial firms, collecting images from whoever was convenient. Although I haven't gone through, I don't know how many notebooks he kept, 40, 50, 60, and in the hundreds of pages. I haven't gone through them all. There is no indication that he made photographs himself that I've been able to discover. For Waterhouse, in most cases, one or two photographs of a work of art was sufficient. He seems to have had little interest in copies from different viewpoints or lighting conditions. Nor was he particularly interested in photographs of details. Waterhouse seldom mentioned photographs, and when he did, it was to criticize them. Writing about this image, for example, Michelangelo's unfinished Rodinini Pietà, Waterhouse notes, "The Alinari photograph 11832 is taken from an angle about 15 to 20 degrees too much to the left and gives a wholly false impression of this most impressive work. The thing not visible in the photograph is that the Virgin's head is just some 8 inches from that of Christ. The lighting of the photograph is also false. Examining Waterhouse's photo archive, one gets the impression of someone who understood photographs not as objective representations of the paintings and sculpture, but as shadows of artworks, effervescent images whose lasting qualities were best captured elsewhere. And in fact, Waterhouse seems to have treated photographs as simple memory aids, secondary to his personal observations, the latter of which he recorded in copious notebooks. They describe paintings in detail, noting their location and placement in particular rooms, and specifying the prominent colors and hues. His description of Ludovico Carracci's Scalzi Madonna is typical. The luminous radiance behind the Virgin is striking pale green, primrose and lilac black, primrose and pale lilac gray behind her head, with a visionary crown of stars. The silver moon below her feet is also luminous. Corners, especially lower ones, in deep shadow. The Virgin in deep dark blue cloak with a purplish shine. There are no other colors, but Jerome is very sunburnt. The silvery brown light over everything, including the very shadowy angel choir. This is a beautiful work, deeply religious in inspiration. When it came to capturing the look of paintings, photographs were not so much reliable objective records as they were a visual aid to recalling the subjective experience he recorded in his precise, diminutive script. For him, photographs were a palimpsest, which allowed him to fill the verso of the prints with notes about the location and measurements of the painting, provenance, bibliography, sales information, reattribution, and whether or not the photograph was made before or after conservation. The information on the versos provided a rich biography for the object represented in the image, and the rectos a trigger for remembering his personal subjective experience. Subjectivity in the art historical photo archive, however, manifests itself in different ways. Between 1859 and 1983, the architectural historian Jan van der Meulen photographed Chartres and churches in the region surrounding the great cathedral. As a former professional photographer, van der Meulen was comfortable making most of the photographs himself, but while the photographer remained the same, his approach to subject matter changed. His photographs of regional churches, documented in approximately 11,000 images, display a subjective, experiential approach. The photographs, and I'm showing you 4 here, of Notre Dame Saint-Ly, for example, replicate the physical experience of the building. I'm showing you a sequence of photographs that move the viewer from the exterior spatial context of the building and central portal to a view of the right portal and then to a closer examination of the side entrance. Seeming to walk from that portal to the left, the viewer examines the jamb figures at an oblique angle, visually articulating a walk to the central portal. Continuing to the center of the building, a photograph shows the jamb figures from the front and in their architectural context, and finally the camera steps forward to show jamb figures close up, filling the frame. In the series, van der Meulen includes some details, but they seem to be a logical extension of these temporal and spatial sequences. In this part of the archive, van der Meulen used photography as an extension of his physical experience of the site. Chartres, however, he photographs entirely differently. Van der Meulen documented Chartres in over 21,000 black and white photographs, over 2,300 color slides, and 1,800 Cibachrome prints. In addition, he made copy prints of over 500 19th century photographs of the building. He systematically captured seemingly every detail of the cathedral, from inside and out, bottom to top, structural underpinnings, sculptural decorations, and stained glass windows. So intent was van der Meulen on capturing the particularities of Chartres that he documented details of the clear-story windows twice, one exposure to reproduce the true color value, and a second slightly overexposed image to capture the inner details and fold lines. While the act of obsessively documenting Chartres over decades is in itself a manifestation of a particular personality type, one might say subjectivity, implicit within his actions was a desire, like Willumson years earlier, to work against the subjectivity of the photograph. The sheer number of images and his return year after year to add more negatives, more visual information, more photographs, is a very different from that of Willumson. It is also distinct from the experiential approach of Waterhouse and the praxis he seems to have used with the regional churches. His 180-degree photographic representation of the head of the central figure in the royal portal removes it completely from the space of the portal and from the figures on the right and left. Furthermore, in these photographs, one does not look up at the figure as would a person standing in the portal at Chartres. Instead, the viewer of the image floats in an abstracted space on the same plane as the sculpted face in a disassociated, omniscient place of intellectual control. This artificial space has little to do with the actual physical experience of the cathedral's entrance. Similarly, his photographs of drapery uncouple the folds from the figure, removing the head and segmenting the body into 3 different photographs. His intention is undoubtedly to capture details of the drapery, but this fragmentation also abstracts and flattens the sculpture. To be sure, these are not the only photographs of the royal portal in the photo archive. There are hundreds. Van der Meulen's continuous return to the cathedral and obsessive photographic campaigns manifest a desire, I would argue, to outstrip through accumulation and sequence the inherent subjectivity of photographic practice. But the more photographs he added to the archive, the further we get from an understanding of the cathedral. Each added detail, each new point of view, each new image further abstracts the objective reflection of Chartres and shatters any possibility of unity into 1,000 different aspects. Willumson sought to overcome the subjectivity of the photographer by selecting an ideal camera viewpoint, one that would distill the qualities of the sculpture into a single image. Van der Meulen's photographs of Chartres remove those interpretive functions from the maker of the image and place them directly onto the audience or the viewer. The massive number of photographs in Van der Meulen's archive means that one must sort, select, and organize in order to arrive at an understanding of the monument. This work creates a unique, subjective interpretation of Chartres, an understanding derived not from personal experience, but from the mass of Van der Meulen's photographs, and from individual judgment. While the subjectivity of reception is similar to that of Waterhouse, there is a critical difference. Unlike Waterhouse, Van der Meulen's photographs act not as transparent reminders of an earlier experience, but as opaque objects of the viewer's attention. And this shift of attention from experience to the photographic object engages the subjectivities associated with the photographic image. Just as the foreground of a photograph may be blurred by a lens focusing on the background object, similarly, when a scholarly attention shifts from the object of the camera gaze to the chemical trace of that look, one is faced with a new set of challenges. Single photographs can be influenced in many ways by the subjectivity of the photographer, physically setting the camera in relationship to the object, lighting and framing it within the rectangle of the camera's ground glass, and pictorially removing it from its spatial context. These are just a few of the interpretive acts that can be found embedded in the photograph. The very idea of the photo archive means that scholarly and commercial collections of photographs are shuffled and individual images dealt into canonical categories: chronological period, country, school, artist, subject, date. The subjectivity in the staging of these surrogate art objects by the archivist has been amply demonstrated by my colleague Joan Schwartz, and consequently I will not take time with it here. Suffice it to say that, in the case of the art historical photo archive, the system created to foster a physical separation from the subjective aesthetics of the original, to provide an illusion of intellectual distance, and to reify a presumed experience of objectivity. Institutional collections seek comprehensiveness in an effort to overcome the subjectivity or inaccuracy inherent in a single photographic image. Traditionally, they acquire images from photographers, individual scholars, and subsidized photo campaigns, to name a few of the methods, and organize and integrate these collections into larger compilations of images. By collecting widely and deeply, the best photo archives present their viewers with a variety of perspectives and details, an artist's oeuvre, school, or period. Through their vast scope, institutional archives attempt to approach an objective representation of the history of art. The creation of a linear history of works of art is accomplished at the expense of a number of alternatives. When a dealer's archive, for example, is integrated into existing canonical categories, the dealer's role in the art market and in canon formation is lost. This diffusion further effaces the connection between the subjectivities of the market, in which authentication means cash, and the dispersal into photo archives, and finally, the interpretation by the art historian. For the viewer of a traditional comprehensive archive, the shift in position of the photograph is marked not only by the removal of personal experience. As one stares attentively at the photograph, the temporal dimension shifts from the past, when the photograph was made or collected, to the present and the moment of viewing. In changing the temporal dimension of photographs, one disconnects the images from their object biographies, which has the effect of masking the subjectivities found in the photographs as objects in and of themselves. This act of archival work obscures the authorial social context of the photograph, transforming them into objective data and staging them for interpretation by the researcher. From within this canonical positioning, the researcher makes the final selection that shapes the photographs into a preferred representation of the subject. Researchers certainly bring individual sensibilities to the performance of the photo archive, but on a significantly narrowed stage. The performance of the photographer who decontextualizes the subject, and the archivist who organizes and classifies, predisposes the photo archive to studies based on connoisseurship and to a lesser extent iconographical analysis. Although researchers can move outside these practices, they do so only with great difficulty, reading against the grain of the photo archive's inherent subjectivities. Rather than merging collections in an attempt to create an archive that appears to be more objective representation of works of art and their histories, photo archives might consider preserving the subjectivity that is inherent in the process of making, collecting, and organizing photographs of works of art. As the definition of the history of art expands to embrace other fields and methodological approaches, the photo archive should support images and collections that retain the traces of their subjectivity, ideology, and methodological underpinning. We must respect the historicity of individual archives and not sacrifice the original sets of practices, institutions, and methodological relationships for the pseudoscience of excessive accumulation and classification. I would like to suggest that photo archivists consider seeking collections that allow researchers to glimpse the cultural work that photographers, archivists, and researchers do. Materials that call attention to the photo archive's changes, inventions, and attachments. In the late 19th century, scholars asked whether or not photographs were adequate surrogates for the work of art. In the early 21st century, the question seems to have turned to whether or not the computer screen is an adequate surrogate for the photographic print. If the photograph is nothing more than a visual reminder of one's subjective experience of the object, the digital representation would seem to me to be more than adequate. Or if one values the photograph purely as a source of textual information, the location or sales history found in the verso, for example, again, the computer would seem to be able to deliver that content quickly and easily. Furthermore, as several recent projects have demonstrated, the digital realm presents the possibility of crowdsourcing and an opportunity for scholars across humanistic and scientific disciplines to share expertise about an individual object. If, however, the digital image is not a surrogate for the experience, but a substitute for the photograph as an object, a new set of problematic subjectivities would seem to be in play. The critical substitution of the digital for the hard copy rests on the same questionable assumptions that brought the photo archive into existence in the 19th century, namely that photographs, or in this case digital screens, are precise and objective echoes of the objects they represent. Now, one of the primary arguments for digitization is the possibility of creating larger, more comprehensive archive of images. This potential of new media is exciting and may be valuable, especially if it takes over the traditional role of the photo archive and allows photo archives to transform themselves into new types of scholarly resources. But larger does not necessarily mean better or smarter. Any rethinking of the photo archive as a digital instrument must engage any number of significant questions. How can one compensate for the loss of the juxtapositions and the sequences that are possible using the photo archive? Under what circumstances can the viewer overcome the experience of the screen image as homogenized and flat? How can individual photo archives with their special subjectivity be maintained in the digital sphere? What will it mean for the experience of the photo archive to divorce the image completely from the photographic object and the tactility of its reception? And ultimately, it seems to me, questions about how the digital archive will reconnect the viewer with the indeterminate nature of photographic meaning and the ways in which that meaning is dependent on its circumstances of production, its presentational possibilities, and its reception by individual viewers. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. This is weird that we push the speaker to the side and I get the podium. But thank you. Makes it easier for me to hold on to all my notes. So for the gentleman who was really against this idea about photography and objectivity, I hope you're still here because Glenn's talk was all about photography and subjectivity. Subjectivity as it exists in the maker of the images, in the saver or collector of the images, and in the user or reader of the images. You also talk about how the photograph itself becomes a cross-section for all of these uses. Do you want to illuminate that a little bit more, the sort of the glossy surface versus the support as a metaphor for this use of the photograph?
Yeah, what I was trying to get at, what I was trying to get at was trying to give a kind of visual representation for what it seems to me is what happens with a photograph when you're looking at it. And the first reaction, and it's still the public reaction, is that what sits on that surface is what is the photograph, when in fact it is based on a whole set of subjectivities, some of which I tried to outline in this talk. The last slide I included was that slide, and I did so somewhat reluctantly, one, because I was afraid it would distract. But the other thing is you've noticed there were two cross-sections, one of a salted paper print and one of an albumin print, one of which was soaked inside the paper and inside the base, the salted paper print, and one of which actually had a thin surface of coating of some type. So I'll leave it to each one of you how invested you are in some kind of objectivity of the photograph, whether or not you see it as completely subsumed in that base of subjectivity, or whether or not you think it has some thin veneer of objectivity in relationship to the subject that it's being represented.
I wonder if when we speak with Paul, we might bring in this idea of the computer screen itself, too, as an analogy there. Let's see. So you have two kinds of subjectivity, one that is based on the idea of photographs as memory aids or palimpsests, and the other that tries to combine numerous photographs into an experiential approach. And both of those really, especially the latter, leaving the work to be done by the viewer, to work through that many images and to figure out what the interpretive functions of the image should be rather than what the maker of them intended them to be, which is very different from let's see, I have to get these names right, Waterhouse's approach. He's telling you what the colors are, everything. He's giving you all the information that was missing, that is missing from those black and white photographs.
Yes, the only change I'd make to that is that it seems to me that what's interesting about Waterhouse, and for that matter interesting about Vandermeulen, is that Waterhouse isn't making it for you. He's making it for himself. And so as a result, he only needs one or at most two photographs because it's just to remember, oh yes, now I remember exactly what that looked like. But I think what's really important to him are his notes in those journals, which describe, I gave you a brief part of, generally a painting will take up an entire half page or entire page of one of the journal entries. So that's what's critical to him. Vandermeulen, I think, I don't know whether it's because he's a photographer, I certainly don't think he thought in postmodern terms, but I think he instinctively understands that photographs are limited in what they can do. So he tries to overcome the subjectivity by giving you so many photographs that it's now an objective archive of Chartres. And everybody should be happy with that, but in fact, what I argue is that all he does is shift the subjectivity onto the viewer. So,
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have questions? We have a question here. Thank you.
Glenn, I'm an archivist at Oberlin College, and two art historians, Clarence Ward and Wolfgang Steckow, we have their papers, and they have, of course, like any early 20th century, mid-century art historians, they have huge quantities of study prints. That's what we call them. Most of them are not annotated in any way. To us, they have very little research value. Would you contradict that?
would I contradict that they don't have any research value?
Not much research value. Nobody wants to see them, and we have them. We have them. They're in nice boxes. They're described, you know, but what research value do they have? They're just study prints.
I mean, the honest answer from me is that I don't know, but I would. But what if it were my archive? I mean, if I were working on it, first thing I'd do is look at where they taught, what they published. I mean, you can create a kind of context for it, I think. Do you have something you wanted to say as well, Costanza? I mean, I certainly would not argue that you should get rid of them.
I think you should invite Glenn to come take a look at them.
Absolutely.
Thank you. As archivists, we have the duty to preserve photographs for the research of the future. We don't know maybe of the research value now, but we still have the duty to preserve this material.
I'd also think that they might be contextualized as well within the circle of where they were educated or where they taught, or, you know, there's a lot of possibilities, I think. It certainly makes it more difficult. It's nice to have Waterhouse writing all these notes for you. And unfortunate that Vandermeulen didn't leave me anything specific to go on.
We can take one more question, and then we will have Paul join us here at the front for the panel discussion. Is there one more question for Glenn? Here we go.
No, he did not. There is no, as a matter of fact, I contacted the last university where he taught, and they had no record of him ever having taught there. So I sort of despaired ever coming up with, because that's exactly what I would have loved to have seen. I always want that documentary resource. But such is life.
Okay, thank you. Let's have Paul join us up at the front. Okay, thank you. So a question came in the earlier panel discussion how the three presentations were brought together. And I must admit, when I read the titles of the two presentations, I thought, how do these relate? But in fact, I think that Paul's presentation of the study of the seven case studies of users of the Library of Congress is a really great complement to Glenn's being one of these, or presenting two case studies of how he has used archives or portions of archives. The question came up, Glenn, about losing the context of the specific archive by integrating it into a larger archive. And you mentioned that both of these archives, the van der Meulen archive and the Willumson archive, is that correct? Williams or Williamson?
Waterhouse?
Sorry, you're Williams, Waterhouse. I'm a little lightheaded, getting over a cold. The Waterhouse archive are both housed here at the GRI, and I think the question came up as to whether they're part of photo archives or special collections, and this might be a question that is assisted by Tracy Schuster, but do you know which aspect of the GRI's collection you accessed, and does that make a difference? Do you think, did that make a difference in your research?
Whether or not they were housed in the photo archive of the special collections, because it's the GRI, it made no difference because they would pull both for me if I needed them. I would say the critical element is that I didn't have to go through how many boxes of Italian Renaissance paintings and pull out all the Waterhouse. You know, they were the GRI for at least the last 20 years, I think, is a kind of model of what I was thinking about, of not integrating these sort of scholarly archives, or for that matter, market archives, commercial archives, into the sort of bigger
So that
archival
suggests they're
holdings.
part of special collections, is that correct? No. Oh.
I think that, I know that the Waterhouse notebooks might be, or are they not?
Waterhouse is split in 3 places.
Okay.
Photo archive, special collections, and library in general.
Complicated. So we have then this idea of our expert users and our community, the community to which they belong, kind of enhancing that level of specificity, or in some cases obsession. And I wonder if you can respond or relate to Glenn's accessing this physical material here at the GRI versus all of the instances in your case study where you said none of these people have ever been anywhere near the Library of Congress.
Yeah, 5 of the 7 had not been to the Library of Congress. The 2 that did go to the Library of Congress absolutely felt beholden to the original source material. Heather Sontag's dissertation, she said it turned on her being able to handle the original objects and contextualizing their materiality in the context of the individual photographs. But I'm not sure I detected a question, though. I mean, what is...
I misunderstood. I thought that
Yeah.
none of them had been there. So that
None of
your
the
case story,
none of the
your case
discoverers
studies
have. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Because I wanted to get back to this idea of landscaping, storytelling,
Yeah.
and discovering.
Right.
And before we talk about the sort of vector drawings and all of that, wonder if, Glenn, you might be able to tell us if you think Waterhouse was interested in landscaping or storytelling or discovering, and then also van der Meulen, if you have a sense of where they might fit into Paul's breakdown of those 3 categories.
It's interesting.
In part, what you're testing is how good my notes are.
Or whether you were listening to...
Oh, I actually was. I've got 3 pages of notes, but that's so I could take it home and digest it. I would definitely, well, the only place he could possibly be, it would seem to me, is landscaping. He's certainly not storytelling, as I understand it. And the third was, discovery.
Discovery.
And he's not interested in discovery at all.
Right. The landscaping mode is the closest to our what traditional archives has seen as the best and appropriate uses of photograph collections, and it's also the closest to what academic art historians and visual studies scholars who always are looking at context, and and that view is reinforced by the academy, which validates your work is and a scholar's work is validated by the peer community within which they associate and write, and so the community, if an art historian all of a sudden would want to become a discoverer, it would be a pretty big paradigm shift for them intellectually and academically. So I think they are discrete they're discrete worldviews, and they do drive. But we have a preferred type of user that tends to be the landscaper and the others. It's the same with archives. The way I worked in an archives for all these years, and you know, the genealogists account for 50% of the use of most public archives, and they're the least. Oh, another genealogist just walked in. I mean, it's, you know, so there are users, and then there are preferred users, and we want to be careful of that.
Can I follow up on this a little bit and give a different answer?
Yeah.
I'm not sure he'd be any of them, because as I understand from my notes, and I've now understand landscaping for about 2 hours, so I certainly don't understand it the way you do. But there's somebody who's interested in the context of the image and moving outside the frame.
Yeah.
And it seems to me he's very much in the frame.
Yeah.
That's what he cares the most about. Maybe the context of the room
Right.
that it hangs in. But so are there a whole set of users then potentially that don't fit into this model?
Well,
and are they art
I
historians?
kind of threw a wrench into that question because you were speaking about collectors of photographs
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
whose collections then have arrived in an archive for them to be used by others. But there was one point where makers, collectors, and readers or users of archives were brought together.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's another.
I'm keen to have Sally Stein ask a question because I know she has to leave, and I'd love to have her get in the question before she leaves.
First of all, I think it's such a great pairing, these two presentations. I mean, I actually thought, okay, who's going to take odds on where we're at in terms of authenticity, the old Benjaminian question of aura, picture versus image, etc. But I'm actually surprised, Glenn, whom I have great admiration for, and I loved both papers, thank you, that starting with Berenson and that great picture of him in some kind of Borsalino, I love that hat, but with the magnifying glass, that it seems to me this is the image of getting close for discovery, and what more recent postmodernists have sometimes argued, especially feminist reading in detail, in terms of a reprise of that, so that part of our interest in photographs, sometimes also with images, especially if we can expect high resolution, is to be able to get to details and then work comparatively and contextually as well. I mean, I think we're constantly moving between the micro and the macro, or some of us try to do so. It's not a question so much as a comment. I'll shut up now.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And one of the things that troubled me about my paper, frankly, it had certain constraints in terms of time. But I didn't want to sound like a Luddite. I'm ambivalent about digitizing everything. I mean, for one thing, if you think about it, photography has always been a reproductive medium. So why would we not think it should be reproduced more?
Yeah.
But I think that there are certain challenges. And certainly I think that picture of Berenson is very different than a photo archive, than an archive of photographs of works of art.
Right.
I mean, that was sort of the frame that I was trying to think about.
I wasn't saying it was not that, but I was saying it spoke to this desire to move in very close
Yes.
and try to find in detail certain clues that a standard view or a contextual view might miss.
Well,
Certainly.
and I think, Paul, I think I called them Venn diagrams,
Yeah.
indicated how there can be aspects of discovery and landscaping, discovery and storytelling. But to Glenn's credit, I love that quote that he made saying that it seemed that in the 19th century we had the question of the photograph as a surrogate for the art object, and then now in the 21st century we're asking if the computer screen is an adequate surrogate for the photographic print in the archive. I thought that was so spot on. But let's see if there are other questions.
Yeah.
Two here first, the back row, and then Anne.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to, I guess, make just a comment and then ask you for your reflection on it. And that is that I wonder what you think about whether or not digitization of archives is going to have an impact on historiography. And the reason I ask is that we're talking a lot about technology as digital and as a reproductive medium, and yet, as we know from science technology studies, other fields, that there are a lot of other kinds of technologies, including analytic tools. And one thing I'm wondering is whether there is a risk in focusing so much on technology as simply reproducibility of one work of art into another form of it, that we're losing a sense of what photography means and has meant, and we're kind of reinforcing a false premise of photography to begin with, so in other words, just kind of moving backward. So I don't know whether or not, I wonder whether or not you think that the technological changes, whether those are limited or there are possibilities in that, have any significance for the ways that people are going to think about photography in a broad sense. Does that?
Yeah. A point I was trying to make at the end when I sort of went off on what until I write it formally is a tangent on media archaeology, is to make the point that in trying to move beyond a pure representational model of digital imaging technologies, we need to recognize, and so we're going through a phase where the analogy to photography, which I started with Mitchell's two triangles communication model, is we're seeking for the comfort of analogy, and as a result are not ready yet to fully embrace the potentialities of the digital products that are resulting from all of this work. It's when we move beyond the representational model to looking at the dynamism of the pixels and the potential analytical work that can be done with high-resolution work, that we can then begin imagining a difference, a different way of thinking, a different way of inquiry that's facilitated by this new kind of content. But it first means breaking the representational bond and recognizing that digital imaging, by moving from an analog to a grid of pixels, has fundamentally transformed that thing. And the problem is it's visual. With text, we already are there. We know that when we code a text, that we've created something else because it doesn't look, behave, or smell like a text. But when you apply high-resolution imaging to a work of art or to a photograph in particular, it still looks and in many ways behaves like a photograph. And that's where the barrier is at this point. And I think a lot of the questions about objectivity and authenticity have to do with the referent, with our possession of the referent, instead of looking at what the future. That's your question about whether the screen is adequate. For almost everyone that I talk to, the answer is absolutely yes. That doesn't mean that they want to throw away the originals or that they can't occasionally need the original source material. But we could build high-capacity preservation storage facilities and lock it up.
But it seems
it's not
like
going anywhere.
the screen is adequate for the discoverers because of the way that they can utilize
Yes.
the size of the pixels.
Yes, it's an improvement. That's even for landscapers, the access potential, the ability to juxtapose. You mentioned juxtaposition, which you can do on a table with a box of materials, if the archivist will let you take more than one item out of the box at the same time. But if they will, you can juxtapose. But with a light box, a digital light box, so at the very least, it's the same functionality as the reading room, and in most cases, it's a significant advance.
And I'd like to just change the focus a little bit to say I'm kind of less interested. I'm interested, but I'm more interested in sort of reorienting the whole way we think about photo archives in terms of it getting at subjectivity, not whether or not it can make photographs more available or make higher resolution so that there's more detail. But is there a way that either photo archives or digital, there may be the promise of digital in the future, can get at the notion of the subjectivity behind all these photographs, or these photographic archives.
So Anne had a question? Anne, and then Joan.
Paul, I feel better about digitizer now. But I wanted to illustrate the term. I wanted to illustrate that there are all of these questions. So many questions come up when digitizing an archive, and I think that I can cite an example at the Research Institute when we digitized the Julia Schulman Photography Archive, where we had let's say the audience would be discoverers. Touching on Melissa's presentation, these were photographs created for publication under the eye of an editor and interior designers and architects. But it came into this very, let's say, scholarly institution. And we had to make, on top of that, there's a community that's very alive, still using these images and know these images like they're friends,
Yeah.
even if they've never come into contact with the physical images themselves. And when making decisions about digitizing the archive, we made decisions that maybe wouldn't be some decisions that art historians might be happy with. RC prints digitize much better than some of the fiber-based, let's say, prints that would be more exhibition quality. But for exhibition on the web, we would get a better image from something that we wouldn't put in a museum show. And then color caused all kinds of problems. Because he used various film stocks over time, the quality of the color images, that was something we had to sit down and think really carefully about. Some felt we should throw up the images as they were, but that community of discoverers, and I think his heirs or people who were close to him or those architects that were still living wouldn't have been that happy with hot pink images of their work. So we had to make some judgment calls and experiment with equipment to get a desired result. And I think sometimes all that dialogue that happens in a digital lab gets lost in these discussions, and that we are making decisions and we're trying to be as thoughtful and we want to create a meaningful product that has impact, which is the intention of, let's say, going back to all of the creators involved in that image being there. And I know that this is kind of more of a comment than a question, but I always wanted to know how we could make end users more aware of that invisible layer, almost like a photograph or a digital file is visual metadata about something. And that there's all this dialogue within the visual metadata that we see with our eyes, but we can't articulate all the time in a conversation.
I'd say that the Schulman archive is an excellent example of the kind of archive that Paul is talking about, only that straddles art history as well. And my response is that whatever you do, document it. And if there's some sort of documentation with it, some researchers in 20 or 30 years can come along and say, oh, well, this, they did this, that, and the other thing. Who knows what they're going to learn from it?
Yeah.
But they can learn that way as opposed to having it be lost.
I think of it as akin to the extras that are on a DVD of a movie. There's a series of movies that were colorized, black and white films colorized by Legacy Films. And there are these wonderful little vignettes about how they did it and what interviewing the curators. And it goes with. So a digital library collection could have the equivalent of the extras there, that pictures could be taken of the digitization process, et cetera. So, but we do have an obligation to surface this decision making.
Joan has a question, I think, and then Costanza, and then Thomas would like to have the last word.
Okay.
It will have the last word.
First and last.
I wonder, I guess two things. One, whether or not we can take lessons from music. Because if you think, I think that it's interesting to juxtapose the two talks this afternoon because we're talking about very different things. And it's almost like, okay, so put something between Paul and Glenn there, and they're different beasts. It's like there's a musical score, there's the performance at the Kennedy Center, there's a recording on wax, there's a recording on vinyl, there's a recording on tape, there's a recording in digital form. They're all different things. Which one's more authentic? They can be different. So how can we start to understand that these things that we're talking about, the photograph, is different from the digital, is different from the initial experience? And it goes back to, I guess, the idea of evidence, and Anne's question about what do we do with these photographs? It brings up the issue of what are they evidence of? Sorry to end with a preposition. They're not necessarily evidence for the art historian to see the art object. In a collection like that, they're evidence of the person who collected them and why they collected them and where they went to find them and why they have them, in the same way that you would want to know what was in that person's book or book collection, the library. You don't necessarily want to keep the library unless the books are annotated, but it's really nice to have lists of libraries and the great thinkers of the world. Which then goes around to the notion that when Glenn says, well, if Waterhouse's prints are distributed within a photo archive, it reinforces the point that photo archives are not really archives. They're collections, and that they do not follow archival principles, which is you keep things together by the foam. In other words, by the source. And so Waterhouse should be under a box called Waterhouse, which would drive every photo historian crazy if they had to then find 25 different prints of a particular sculpture. So I think that there's some issues that are running around that are not resolved about the nature of evidence and what's it evidence of and what is really an archive and what do we mean by authentic and what really is authentic when we're talking, Paul's talking about digital objects that can be appreciated but not as representative of the photograph from which they have been digitized.
I think it depends to a large extent on what you want the archive to do. What kind of work do you want it to do? Yeah. You know, if you're going in there to do some kind of connoisseurship project, you want all the pictures of whatever painting you're working on. But what I'm suggesting is that by keeping them separate, that whether you want to or not, you're insisting on a new kind of art history, or a new kind of academic discourse. And I just find that positive. I guess but you're right. I mean, somebody could be disturbed that they would have to go to all these different places to pull together all the pictures of this single painting.
I have a question actually for Paul, and I'm curious also about Glenn's comments. I agree with you in many of your, let's say, preliminary conclusions that, for instance, digitization processes should be transparent and documented, that digitized photographs are something else that the analog photographs that they want to reproduce and so on. But I have some problems with some premises of your conclusions, and at the end also with your final conclusion, that is the most users just need the digitized photographs and don't need actually the analog ones. My main problem is that you you define the photographs that are your object of study as sources. and this is a reduction of their epistemological potential, seeing them just as passive sources and reducing them to their visual content. And in fact, this also shape the selection of users that you did, because your users are interested in the visual content, and so they are happy with what they find in the database of the Library of Congress. My idea would be to sensibilize them that there is not only this aspect, but that there is even more than what they can see on the screen. And I agree with you that it is important and necessary, but I would say, exactly as you say, that the digital surrogates are something different than the let's say, original photographs. The use of the database in internet is something different than the use of the photographs in an analog archive. And so they are different sources, different objects, different ways of using them. Right. And so it is an important aspect, otherwise you can come to the conclusion that the digital is enough. It is not enough for me, it is necessary, but it is something additional to the analog. And I would quote not only Joan, who said today, I was very impressed, photographs, or she invited us to look at photographs and archives as having objectives and not being objectives. And I would also quote Elizabeth Edwards saying that photographs and archives have to be seen not just as resources, as passive resources, but as active, resourceful. And this is the main or one of the main aspects of the material approach, to see the photographic objects as autonomous objects that can also say something, and they say what they can say if we took them in the hand, if we consider all the material aspects that at the end are important also to understand them as sources. But as I said, I think that sources is not enough to define photographs.
A rebuttal?
Well, none of the work that I've done, nor any of the work since, has suggested that there isn't a role for the original object, and that there's an important role for libraries and archives and museums to make the physical object as available and usable as possible. My retort is that for every person who wants and needs and thrives on seeing and touching, there are 1 million people who are stimulated to tears almost with access to the digital version. And I think given the cost and the mandate we have as stewards, that we simply have to embrace the 1 million people while not ignoring the 1. And it almost is that level of ratio. And if we privilege the 1 over the 1 million, we will be out of business as cultural heritage organizations by the time we're about ready to retire from our positions. So I'm very concerned that about the lingering negativity over the digital, and trying as a scholar to recognize that when one looks at the transformative applications of digital technologies, that one sees a new horizon of relevance for the mandates we have as stewards of these materials. And that's what my enthusiasm comes from, that, not in denying the materiality of the source. And then one more thing, just by way of retort, because I'm such a wonderful organization here, and I've worked out of many good photographic archives, and the barriers that librarians and archivists place to doing the kind of work that you emotionally and academically and intellectually need to do are very, very severe. The one item at a time, the fetishizing the object, etc., is something that it's a problem, and digital just it comes over. I'm sorry.
Most archivists are extremely dedicated to making things available as much as possible. I'm not sure, I don't know who you're talking about, because my colleagues, we do not place barriers when, our mission is to make collections available and accessible. So I don't understand why you're saying that you
I'm really talking about reading room rules and regulations.
Yeah, I work in a reading room. Can we go?
Can I say, we'll have one more, we'll have Thomas with one more question, but I will say one of the words I wrote down at the end of both of your talks was promise. The promise of the archive, whether it's the physical archive or the digitized archive. And I think those are aspects that bear further exploration, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity in tomorrow's conversations to do that. But let's hear what Thomas has to say or ask.
Virginia, I don't know exactly if this will be should be the last word, but I was thinking during Glenn's talk, I mean, in a certain way, the photo libraries or photo collections, I think both terms are interesting to value, have been built when there was an art historical methodological question. And these questions, of course, change. I recall a seminar with Weitzman where he always told us, who has the most photos wins. And these times are over in a certain sense. And now I am in the camp of Costanza, who says these archives are sources by themselves because they are study objects and we can learn so much from them. We should keep them and should look for different ways to understand how they were brought together. And talking about the GRI collection, we made, in a certain way, a mistake a couple of years ago. We are a young institution, but 10 or 30 years ago, we made a mistake. And I recall that hundreds and hundreds or thousands and thousands of photos came in, and the GRI invited people just to sit there with big piles of photographs and say, nobody knew what it was. And then they said, well, it might be anonymous 16th century France, you know. And then it came into this box. We wouldn't do that anymore. We would keep these photographs together and keep them in the collection from where it came from, probably. Anyway, moving to the digital, we are at a very important and interesting moment where we have the technology to, in a certain way, make accessible more images around the world to support art historical research, although perhaps the art historical methodological questions are not quite visible yet. So in a certain sense, I would continue to digitize material as much as we can to make resources available in countries where they do not exist. And it is a huge progress that we can dispose of this material on our home screen, which enables us to run through material. And there are some colleagues who work with computational questions. I don't know exactly if this is real future, but it is a first step to move into new directions. So in a certain way, what happened here is that resources have been gathered under certain art historical questions which are not anymore the main questions we have today. On the other hand, we have a technology which allows to dispose about a huge amount of images which might be searchable in the next future for new art historical questions which we even don't know yet. Perhaps it's the last word.
I think that's a great last word. Thank you.